Hello everyone, welcome to the Earth Archives. I don't know if you have heard of the Tower of London. It was once one of the most severe prisons, and many famous people were imprisoned here. Today I will introduce the 5 most famous ones. Please subscribe to the program before it starts. If possible, please share it with your friends. Please take care of it. Anne Boleyn, the enigmatic and ambitious second wife of Henry VIII, cast a long shadow across the corridors of English history, her name still whispered with a mixture of awe and tragedy. Born into the influential Boleyn family, Anne grew up steeped in the labyrinthine politics of the Tudor court. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, a shrewd diplomat and courtier, ensured that his children were well positioned in the ever-shifting tides of royal favor. Anne herself was educated in the Netherlands and France, her mind sharpened by the continental sophistication and her spirit imbued with a fierce independence that would set her apart in Henry's court. When Anne returned to England, she was no longer the naive girl who had left for the continent. She was a woman of poise, intelligence, and wit, qualities that attracted attention like a flame in the dark. It was at court, amidst the murmur of silks and the echo of footsteps on stone, that she caught the eye of the king. Henry VIII, robust and commanding, was captivated by this woman who defied convention. Unlike the other ladies of the court who melted under the weight of his gaze, Anne challenged him, spoke boldly, and with a spark in her eyes that promised more than just submission. It wasn't long before Henry's infatuation grew into an obsession. But Anne was no fool. She knew the dangers of yielding too quickly to a king whose passions could both ignite and destroy. She would not become his mistress, as her sister Mary Boleyn had before her. No, Anne wanted the crown, and she would not accept less. In June 1533, the Tower of London became the stage for Anne's greatest triumph. The fortress, with its thick stone walls steeped in centuries of history, had seen kings imprisoned and traitors executed, but on this day it bore witness to something different. Anne, dressed in robes befitting a queen-in-waiting, entered the tower not as a prisoner but as a woman on the brink of coronation. The path from the river was lined with banners and courtiers who whispered behind their hands, some with admiration, others with doubt. To many, Anne was a seductress who had ensnared their sovereign; to others, she was the embodiment of ambition and change. But as the crown settled on her dark hair, Anne looked out over the gathered throngs with a steady gaze. She was queen, and she carried the future in her womb. Yet, the gilded promise of Anne's reign began to tarnish almost as soon as it began. Though she gave birth to Elizabeth, a child who would grow to become one of England's greatest monarchs, the absence of a male heir gnawed at Henry. The court, with its ceaseless flow of whispers and jealousies, turned against her. Once, Anne's sharp tongue and fiery spirit had been her allure. Now, they were seen as proof of her witchcraft and malignancy. The charges against Anne were staggering in their audacity. Adultery, incest, and treason were whispered in dark corners and brought into the light of the court. Her arrest on May 2, 1536, was swift and merciless. Taken to the Tower of London, she found herself lodged in the lieutenant's lodgings, a room once imbued with hope, now turned into a cell of dread. The same walls that had watched her ascent now bore silent witness to her despair. Her trial, held in the Tower's Great Hall, was a spectacle designed to humiliate and convict. Anne, proud and resolute, defended herself with a brilliance that momentarily silenced her accusers. But it was of no use. The verdict was predetermined, the sentence already written in the air. She was guilty, not just of crimes but of failing to conform to the roles expected of her, of daring to challenge a king's will, and of embodying an ambition that was both admired and feared. On May 19, 1536, Anne ascended the scaffold erected within the Tower grounds. Dressed in a robe of dark damask and an ermine mantle, she maintained a grace that belied the horror of her fate. The French swordsman, brought in to ensure a swift end, stood ready. Anne's final words were marked not by accusation or bitterness but by a composed acceptance that struck those present to their core. "Good Christian people, I come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." The blade, as promised, was swift and precise. The Queen, who had reigned for nearly 3 years, fell in silence, and with her, the hopes she had once carried. Sir Walter Raleigh, a man whose name conjures the scent of sea brine and the whisper of courtly intrigue, strode into the annals of history with an audacity that few could match. He was a soldier whose blade flashed in service of his queen, an explorer who charted courses into the unknown, and a writer whose pen captured the sweep of civilizations. The tale begins in the golden glow of Elizabethan England, where Sir Walter Raleigh first carved out his place among the glistening throng of courtiers that filled the halls of power. Born to a family of modest wealth, his rise was not preordained but hard-earned, forged through the fires of battle and the subtle dance of favor in Queen Elizabeth I's court. The Queen, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, was known for her fierce intelligence and her capacity to both nurture and destroy those who sought her favor. Raleigh's initial victories came on the battlefield. He was a commander whose men followed him with the fervor of those who believed in his invincibility. It was this loyalty, paired with his daring exploits and poetic charm, that drew him into the Queen's orbit. Elizabeth knighted him in 1585, a gleaming accolade that formalized what many already knew: Raleigh was a rising star. His ambitions, however, were not limited to courtly pageantry or the spoils of war. He was an explorer at heart, a man driven by the relentless pursuit of glory that lay beyond the horizon. Yet, even as Raleigh's legend grew, so too did the shadow of discontent. Elizabeth I, though she prized his loyalty, could be unforgiving. Her court was a gilded cage of gossip, alliances as fragile as spun sugar, and Raleigh's audacity had led him into dangerous territory. The cause of his first imprisonment in 1592 was a scandal that rocked the court: his secret marriage to Elizabeth Throckmorton, one of the Queen's beloved maids of honor. The Queen's wrath was swift and sharp, for she saw such betrayals as affronts to her sovereignty. Raleigh and his new bride were cast into the Tower, where the grey walls loomed over them like sentinels of fate. The imprisonment was brief, a mere storm before the calm, and Raleigh soon returned to court, chastened but unbroken. The turn of the century brought with it a different monarch and a chilling change in Raleigh's fortunes. When King James I took the throne in 1603, Raleigh's place in the sun began to slip beneath dark clouds. James had little use for the brash knight who had once basked in Elizabeth's light, and rumors of plots and conspiracies swirled like a foul wind. Accusations of treason were cast upon Raleigh, a charge as damning as it was dangerous. He was once more sent to the Tower, this time as a condemned man facing the looming spectre of death. The Bloody Tower, a section of the fortress that had earned its name from centuries of grim deeds, became Raleigh's reluctant home for the next 13 years. Here, amidst the damp chill of stone walls that seemed to whisper the secrets of its countless prisoners, Raleigh's indomitable spirit did not break but transformed. If his sword was rendered useless, his mind was still sharp as ever. Raleigh's imprisonment was not one of squalor but a curious twilight existence of privilege and confinement. His high status afforded him a room that was more study than cell, furnished with books, a desk, and the comfort of his family, who came to live with him. It was within these confines that Raleigh turned to the sciences, alchemy, and the grand sweep of history. By candlelight, he inked the pages of his History of the World, a sprawling work completed in 1614 that wove together the lessons of empires long past with the reflections of a man who had known both the heights of power and the depths of despair. The years wore on, and outside the Tower, the world shifted. Kings plotted, explorers ventured forth, and the fortunes of England ebbed and flowed with the tides of history. Raleigh watched from behind the lattice of his prison window as whispers of opportunity reached him. In 1616, the iron door swung open, and freedom came with a condition. Raleigh was to lead an expedition to the New World, to seek out the fabled city of El Dorado, a dream of gold that had haunted European imaginations for generations. Raleigh's heart, tempered by years of waiting and longing, flared once more with hope. This was a chance, not just to reclaim his honor, but to stand, free and triumphant, under the sunlit skies of an endless horizon. Raleigh's expedition, fraught with disease and dwindling resources, reached the breaking point when his men clashed with a Spanish outpost, a violation of James I's strict orders to avoid conflict. The consequences were swift and unforgiving. Upon Raleigh's return to England, the king's patience had run dry. The Spanish, already vexed by England's audacious privateers and expanding influence, demanded Raleigh's punishment. James, eager to appease the Spanish crown and distance himself from his predecessor's unruly favorite, ordered Raleigh's arrest. His final days were a strange blend of defiance and resignation. On the morning of October 29, 1618, he walked to the scaffold with the unhurried stride of a man who had long made peace with his fate. The crowd gathered in silence as Raleigh addressed them, his voice steady and tinged with the echoes of past glories. "I have a long journey to go," he said, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, some sympathetic, others indifferent. He laid his head upon the block, refusing the blindfold, and murmured to the executioner, "Strike, man, strike." The blade fell, swift and final, severing not just Raleigh's life, but an era marked by bold dreams and unforgiving realities. The princes in the tower, the sun dipped low over London, casting the ancient spires and battlements of the Tower of London in a crimson glow that seemed to bleed into the stone itself. This fortress, whose thick walls had borne witness to centuries of whispered secrets and cries muffled by the cold, relentless night, now loomed over its newest occupants, the young Edward V and his little brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. It was 1483, and though spring breathed new life into the city outside, an air of unease settled within the tower's iron gates. 12-year-old Edward, who had known the royal apartments of the tower as a prince of promise, now stood peering out through the narrow window slits, the familiar sound of the Thames a murmur that could not soothe his troubled heart. They had arrived here not as guests but under the directive of their formidable uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The prince had always known his uncle as a stalwart figure at court, a man whose presence radiated confidence, with eyes that missed nothing and a voice that cut through the din of even the most raucous banquets. But in the wake of their father, King Edward IV's death, everything had changed. Whispers slithered through the halls like snakes, their sibilant warnings making their way into the ears of those who would listen. The late king's sons were in danger. Edward's mind, still caught between the playfulness of childhood and the gravity of his royal birthright, could not grasp the full scope of the machinations unfolding around him. At first, life in the tower was not so different from what it had been in their palatial residences. The boys were attended by servants, they played games in the courtyard, and their rooms were adorned with tapestries that depicted the chivalric tales of old. Yet, the comfort was a veneer, a facade that could not hold back the creeping dread that had seeped into the stones. When news reached Edward that his coronation had been postponed indefinitely, the boy king felt the cold touch of betrayal. His uncle, whom he had trusted as a protector, had made a claim against his legitimacy. Richard of Gloucester had used Parliament to declare that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, and thus, Edward and his siblings were bastards. The crown that had shimmered just beyond his reach was now gone, stolen by the very man who had sworn to defend it. At first, there were sightings. Guards and other servants would report seeing the boys from a distance, playing in the courtyard or standing by a window. Their laughter would echo, brittle and thin against the vast stone walls. But as the summer days wore on, the glimpses became fewer, the sounds of their youthful voices extinguished as suddenly as a candle in a gale. By the time autumn began its chill descent upon London, The two boys had disappeared as though the tower itself had swallowed them whole. The rumors were quick to spread, carried by messengers and street criers, reaching ears from the lowest beggar to the highest courtier. The official line was silence, a quiet that spoke louder than any proclamation. It did not take long for accusations to surface. Richard III, as he was now crowned, was implicated by many, cast in the role of the dark usurper whose ambition knew no bounds. Stories of muffled footsteps in the dead of night, figures cloaked in shadow moving up the spiral staircases with unnatural purpose, circulated like fever dreams. Some swore they heard cries stifled too quickly, or saw a faint glimmer of light from behind the slits of the garden tower when all should have been still. But just as quickly as the rumors bloomed, they were stifled under the weight of the king's rule. Fear was a powerful tool, and Richard III wielded it with precision. The disappearance of the princes became a whispered legend, a tale told in confidence with a darting glance over the shoulder. Years rolled on, and the memory of Edward V and his brother, once destined for glory, faded like the ink of an old manuscript. It would not be until 1674, nearly 2 centuries later, that the story would resurface with new life. During renovations in the White Tower, laborers struck a macabre discovery: the skeletal remains of 2 children, buried beneath the stairwell. The bones were never conclusively proven to belong to the princes, yet the circumstantial evidence was enough to rekindle the fire of doubt that had smoldered for centuries. Some claimed the discovery as proof of Richard III's villainy, a king who would snuff out the lives of children to secure his hold on the throne. Guy Fawkes's story begins not with fire and rebellion, but in the cold, shadowed halls of England where religious tension simmered like embers waiting for a spark. Born in 1570, Fawkes grew up in an England torn apart by the Protestant Reformation and the ensuing persecution of Catholics. A seasoned fighter, Fawkes spent years honing his craft on battlefields far from home. Under the Spanish flag, he fought against the Protestant Dutch forces in the 80 Years' War, where blood mixed with the mud beneath his feet and cannons roared like gods of war. His skills and his unflinching courage earned him respect and a dangerous conviction that England could be set right only with drastic action. When he returned to England in 1604, he was no longer just a soldier. He was a man with a purpose so fierce it bordered on zealotry. It was then that he met Robert Catesby, the charismatic mastermind with a plot as audacious as it was deadly, to strike at the very heart of English power and dethrone the Protestant King James I by blowing up the House of Lords during the opening of Parliament. The night of November 4, 1605, was damp, the air thick with the chill that crept in from the River Thames. Fawkes stood by the door of the storeroom, cloaked in darkness, the coarse wool of his garments scratching against his skin. The stillness was broken only by the faint lapping of water outside and the echo of footsteps patrolling the palace grounds. In the quiet, Fawkes's mind raced with anticipation, each passing minute a heartbeat closer to the moment that would change England forever. But fate, with its sly and unyielding hand, had already begun to shift the pieces against him. An anonymous letter, cryptic and filled with enough detail to alarm its recipient, had found its way to the authorities. The warning was enough for a search to be ordered, and as the hours slipped into the early dawn of November 5, the storeroom's secrets were unveiled. Sentenced to die by the barbaric method reserved for traitors, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, Fawkes faced the final hours of his life with the grim acceptance of a man who had known the cost from the beginning. On January 31, 1606, beneath a sky as grey and impenetrable as the walls of the tower that had confined him, he was led to the gallows at Westminster Yard. The crowd, a writhing mass of faces eager for spectacle, jeered and spat. But Fawkes, even in defeat, would not grant them the sight they craved. With a last defiant act, he leapt from the ladder, his body twisting in the air, and met death on his own terms, his neck snapping before the executioner could lay a hand on him. Lady Jane Grey's story began not in the shadowed halls of power but in the echoing corridors of a childhood spent surrounded by scholars and ambitions not her own. Born into the influential Grey family in 1537, Jane was a child of privilege, a niece of King Henry VIII through her mother, Lady Frances Brandon. She was raised not with tales of fairy tale courts but with the harsh realities of Tudor politics whispered in the night, each conversation tinged with the sharp awareness that bloodlines were both a gift and a burden. The Tempest began with the flickering life of King Edward VI, the young, pale boy king whose health was as fragile as the pages of his father's old decrees. Edward, a devout Protestant, lay dying in the summer of 1553, and with each breath, the line between power and peril thinned. England, too, lay on the cusp, poised between the Protestant reforms Edward had championed and the prospect of returning to the old Catholic faith under his half-sister, Mary. Edward's advisers, men who whispered strategies in dark corners and saw Jane not as a girl but as a pawn, set their sights on her as the answer to their fears. Chief among them was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, whose eyes glittered with both shrewd calculation and desperation to secure his own influence. He brokered Jane's marriage to his son, Guilford Dudley, a union not born of love but of necessity and ambition, a gilded chain binding them all to a single, audacious plot. Edward's last days were marked by fevered prayers and frantic signatures. On his deathbed, surrounded by men whose shadows loomed as large as their intentions, Edward scribbled out a will that passed the crown to Jane, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth, his half-sisters. It was a document inked in the panic of religious certainty, a boy's effort to sculpt the future while the weight of kingship slipped from his grasp. When he died in early July, the gears of the plot began to turn, the grinding cogs pushing Jane into the throne room before she could catch her breath. On July 10, 1553, she entered the Tower of London not as a captive but as its queen, a girl of just 16 years whose slight frame was dwarfed by the ceremonial robes that fell stiffly from her shoulders. The crown, heavy with jewels and centuries of expectation, was placed upon her brow, an ironic circlet of triumph and doom. The people's allegiance to Mary, the eldest daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, ran deeper than the proclamations nailed to church doors. They saw in her not the flame of her mother's faith, enduring and unwavering, but a birthright now challenged by an interloper. It took only days for Mary to raise her supporters. By November 1553, Jane stood trial, the charge of treason laid before her like a sentence already spoken. She stood straight, her gaze unblinking as she declared her guilt, not out of complicity but ignorance. Yet Mary's hand stayed the axe, and the girl who had been queen was spared, confined once more to wait in the Tower's hollow silence. On the morning of February 12, Jane was led from her cell. The Tower Green awaited, its grass damp with dew and the shadows of ravens. She was draped in the somber folds of black, a small figure moving with a grace that belied her years and the heavy certainty that followed each step. The executioner stood ready, his axe gleaming in the pale winter sun. Jane's last words, uttered with a steady voice, were not of anger or fear but a prayer of penance and acceptance. She knelt, eyes closing to the world that had both crowned and condemned her, and laid her head upon the block.